6 months after the coup in Myanmar, the military has named itself as caretaker government. Its leader promises to hold multi-party elections, but will Min Aung Hlaing keep his word? And what's the role of the international community in this ongoing crisis? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Peter Dobbie. 6 months ago, Myanmar was plunged into chaos when the military took power in a coup. It locked up civilian leaders and promised to hold on to power for only a year. But Senior General Min Aung Hlaing has now extended the state of emergency until August 2023. He says he'll hold multi-party elections, but didn't give any other details. The coup triggered mass protests, which the military quashed with a violent crackdown. Some of Myanmar's neighbours in Southeast Asia are now becoming frustrated. Indonesia's foreign minister has urged the military to approve a special envoy from the ASEAN regional bloc, saying there's little progress on a plan to resolve the crisis. We'll bring in our guest in just a moment. First, this report from Tony Cheng in Bangkok.
As an aerobics instructor dances, armoured vehicles block off Parliament in Myanmar's capital Naypyidaw on February the 1st. But if the generals thought it would be a bloodless coup, they couldn't have been more wrong. Months of bitter resistance and a violent military crackdown, with nearly 1,000 killed. 6 months later, the military junta is renaming itself a caretaker government, although it appears it will still hold important positions. And the leading general giving assurances elections will be held soon.
We must create conditions to hold a free and fair multi-party general election. We have to make the preparations. I pledge to hold the multi-party general election without fail.
But it's not clear under what conditions those elections would be held. Since the coup, the military has outlawed the National League for Democracy, Aung San Suu Kyi's party, and rejected its landslide victory in November. New elections would take place under the military's emergency laws, which will be in place for another 2 years. Min Aung Hlaing did say the military would follow the lead of an envoy sent by the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. But that envoy has yet to be appointed, and ASEAN has failed to take a firm line as events have spiralled out of control. ASEAN has been divided on Myanmar in the last 6 months, with Indonesia, Malaysia and Singapore wanting to take a hard line. But the generals here in Bangkok appear to be wanting to give the benefit of the doubt to the generals in Myanmar. What is of growing concern to the international community is the worsening COVID-19 situation in the country. More than half of the world's population lives in countries bordering Myanmar, while inside those borders the virus is spreading unchecked.
The coup has resulted in a near total collapse of the healthcare system, and healthcare workers are being attacked and arrested. The virus is spreading through the population very fast indeed. By some estimates, in the next 2 weeks, half of the population of Myanmar could be infected with COVID.
On the streets of Yangon, protesters set fire to Myanmar's flag. They say they don't want new elections, they just want the military to step down. Tony Cheng, Al Jazeera, Bangkok.
Well, Myanmar's military has been facing growing international pressure since the coup. The United Nations has urged its member states to prevent the flow of weapons into Myanmar. The US, the UK and the EU all have imposed sanctions, but Myanmar's Asian neighbours are reluctant to do the same. After holding crisis talks with General Min Aung Hlaing in April, the ASEAN bloc said the violence must stop, but flatly rejected sanctions. China and Thailand account for more than half of Myanmar's trade volume, and both countries do remain friendly with their powerful military. OK, let's get going. Let's bring in our guests. Joining us on Skype, Dr. Sasa, a spokesman for the National Unity Government of Myanmar, which was formed after the coup by members of the deposed civilian government. In Ottawa, in Canada, we have John Packer, Professor of Law and Director of the Human Rights Research and Education Centre at the University of Ottawa. And in London, we have Maung, a human rights activist from Myanmar. Gentlemen, a warm welcome to you all. Dr. Sasa, exactly 6 months on, do we believe these promised elections will actually take place?
No, this is just propaganda. And then yesterday, the military junta leader have declared himself with just one vote. He voted himself, appointed himself as Prime Minister of the caretaker government, and he saw 27 at least million votes of the people of Myanmar. So even if they hold elections, it will never be free and fair elections. And we already have elections in 2020, which was a free and fair and democratic.
John Packer in Ottawa, why do you think the junta feels the need to keep the emergency rules, the emergency legislation in place until August 2023?
Well, first of all, I agree with Dr. Sasa that this is propagandistic. So I would say there's no reason to believe a word that they say. So I think this is nothing more than a scam, a fictional date in the future. But why they feel the need? Because they seek some kind of legitimacy for their authority. So this is a game. This is basically the junta now asserting, naming themselves titles like prime minister, like caretaker government, to have a patina of legitimacy, and then hoping that this will be bought by the international community. It certainly is not bought by the people of Myanmar.
Maung in London, what did you make of the General's speech, 3 days ago now? Just listening to it or looking at transcriptions of it, it sounded and it read surely very oddly. I mean, at one point he was talking about bioterrorism in relation to COVID, and at another point he was talking about the requirement to grow more onions in the country. It just sounded slightly disconnected from the reality of Myanmar and the accusations being levelled at his junta right now.
Well, bioterrorism, by that he means, the people of Myanmar who refuse to cooperate with the government or military, I should say. We don't have a legitimate government in power in Naypyidaw, refusing to cooperate with the military-controlled health clinics and whatnot, and because the truth of the matter is there's absolutely zero credibility with the military junta and military as an institution, and the growing onion. But the Burmese military regimes successively have been known to be extremely superstitious when it comes to the different type of agricultural practices. And, the 30 years ago, the Burmese the dictator, General Maung, said, we've got a lot of sand, so we could have a Silicon Valley to create computer industry. And then, his successor, the Than Shwe, urged people to grow the physics nuts or something. And, so I think, but the most important thing is what my two co-panelists raised, this junta is trying to basically gain international legitimacy because in September, the United Nations General Assembly is going to seat, or decide on who is going to represent the people of Myanmar. And the junta is trying to show that it is a normal functioning government, and but the reality is completely the opposite. They are not in charge of a proper functioning state, healthcare sector, or economy.
John Packer in Ottawa, you were nodding there listening to Maung in London. I guess you would agree with that, but that's interesting, isn't it? The point that he raises about the United Nations, because the Myanmar ambassador to the United Nations has very much distanced himself from the junta, but his position in that continuing position at the United Nations in New York, it's not decided by the generals in Naypyidaw, it's not decided by the powers that be in Myanmar. It's a decision that goes to the United Nations at the highest level. They decide who's acceptable to them as any country's ambassador.
That's exactly right. I mean, so first of all, I would say there are two elements to this. There is the state of Myanmar as a part of a subject of international relations and law, and there's a question about the character of that state, its territory, its population, and then the key element here, the contentious element, is the government, who speaks for this state and exercises sovereignty, and that's determined by elements of legitimacy of authority and effectiveness. So there's that one element. But a very key element, and I want to emphasize that the pretenders of the junta do not enjoy either effective control in the state, clearly, nor do they enjoy the support of the will of the people. So there's a very fundamental question in Myanmar. But the other side of the coin is the international recognition side. And the Republic of the Union of Myanmar, the state as it's officially called, is a member of the United Nations. And it's for the United Nations to decide who sits and speaks for the state. And that's actually a decision of a body called the Credentials Committee of the General Assembly. And it will meet, it's foreseen to meet in September, and then it may take a decision, it should take a decision. It might push it a little further because it's contentious, but that decision is not a decision of some generals, nor really of anyone else. It's going to be the decision of the member states of the United Nations, who they will recognize as speaking for Myanmar.
Dr. Sasa, how strong is the campaign of civil disobedience that we are still seeing spasmodically on the streets of Myanmar? John Packer and also Maung Zarni both making kind of the same point, which is this, that since the late 50s, no military dictatorship has always controlled all of the country. It's very difficult because there are different composite ingredients always in the mix there.
The nationwide protest against the military junta in Myanmar remain strong. This CDM movement is most powerful non-violence movement against the military junta in the history of Myanmar. In fact, this peaceful movement is stronger and powerful than the military junta act of terrorism, as this is not only just about CDM participants. This is also the nationwide protest against the military junta reign of terror in Myanmar. And the people of Myanmar are facing terrorism against them. These military junta that we are facing are not just military junta. They have killed more than 1,000 men and women. No country in the world should try to legitimize this killing. And they have arrested more than 6,000 innocent people of Myanmar because of their thirst for power. We will never allow normalization of this act of terrorism against the people of Myanmar. 1.2 million people of Myanmar have been displaced by these military aggressions, and 6.4 million people of Myanmar are going to be without food. They will be going to starve by the end of October this year.
Okay.
And 27 million people
right.
are going to be in the poverty line.
Maung Zarni in London, difficult to confirm via a trustworthy independent source how many people have been arrested, but it's surely in the thousands. When it comes to those people who've been arrested or detained or interviewed by the relevant authorities, or indeed people who've chosen to leave the country, a lot of them are healthcare providers. Can we say that the junta is, in effect, weaponizing COVID? Because so many of those healthcare providers have been at the leading edge of the protest movement, and unashamedly, the junta have gone after them.
I have been arguing that the military junta has weaponized medical oxygen. You know, not the virus. They have no control over the virus, but they have control over who have access to medical oxygen. And so the military has, put in place severe restrictions in the private sector, the market, the civil society, in terms of the COVID-stricken population. We now have the world's third largest COVID-infested population. And, just a couple of days ago, the United Nations has issued a very stern warning that within the next 2 or 3 weeks, half of the country's 54 million population could be, COVID positive, but no one's really testing. And we're just looking at bodies piling up at cemeteries. And instead of providing and cooperating freely and, out of goodwill and in good faith with the international organizations, the military junta is building more crematoriums. So, you can tell the nature of the regime. I think I want to bring in one thing that is very important. This is the very military that has spearheaded the genocidal campaign against Muslim Rohingyas in 2016 and 2017. And there is actually international legal proceeding at the International Court of Justice, and also there's a full investigation by the International Criminal Court, specifically targeting the state or the military leadership. And so, the military has gone from, worst to worst. And the question is, why is the United Nations Security Council and top?
Okay, let me put some of those points, Maung, Zarni in London, to John Packer. The point about crematoria, this junta is signalling it's getting ready to cremate up to 3,000 bodies per 24 hours. That's death on an industrialized scale. 230,000 people have been displaced inside the country to get away from what the junta is doing. Some of the borders have been closed, so they can't cross the border into some of the neighboring countries, and they can't go back to where the places they might call home. Is it fair of me to say the country is in free fall in a completely unique situation that we have not seen before, even by the standards of what's been going on historically in Myanmar?
I think that's correct. I mean, there's a few elements to this. There is the egregiousness. It's hard to overemphasize this, of the atrocities, but we're seeing that the junta is it's kind of turning the instruments of state against its own population. Now, remember that the legitimacy of authority here derives not only from the will of the people, but the purposes of using that authority, which is supposed to be for the well-being of the population. That's not me saying that. That's in the UN Charter. This is a test for the United Nations. Is it serious about this? Because it's very clear that the junta has no interest in the will of the people. It is seeking to maintain its power as effectively a criminal gang. There is no constitutional or international legal authority for this. And the potential here is not only utter destruction of the society of Myanmar, but increasingly a threat to peace and security in the region. You mentioned not only the displacement internally, but also refugees across borders, now increasing instability with the resistance movement and so forth. This can have substantial spillover. And there are many people who are talking about a kind of scenario that we've seen elsewhere in the world, a kind of Syria type of situation, which I remember well, working with the United Nations at the time. In 2012, for example, had only 6,000 deaths at one point, so not much different than Myanmar, and we have Syria as it is today. So it's not beyond the imagination to say what's happening in Myanmar has the potential to do something unprecedented in the region, which is the implosion of a state in the heart of Southeast Asia.
Dr. Sasa, what do people like you and your organization do if, almost 6 months to the day since the coup, in the very early days of February of this year, this is actually what we're seeing unfolding in real time, is actually the beginnings of the military hanging on to power? They've got fingerprints to show that they've done it before.
We have everything in a place. The people of Myanmar are the most important here. And the people of Myanmar have said enough is enough. And they are in a situation of do or die. and that these military junta have declared the war on the people of Myanmar 6 months ago. And now they are discharging battlefield weapons. And my country is now in the brink of the great civil war that will end in genocide. We don't like to see that happen. So we are trying our best to bring all the people together in the way that how to minimize that death. At the same time, it's COVID-19 surging under the watch of this military junta. So it is just clear that these military junta, they are losing the power and the control, but that is dangerous for everyone. Now we have no government in Myanmar. In the rest of the world, the governments are taking care of COVID-19 and controlling it. Now in my country, there's no government that's controlling it. So we are heading into the great civil war.
Maung Zarni in London, would you concur with what John Packer was saying, that Myanmar might yet spin down into being the new Syria, in as much as the World Food Programme saying in the next 6 months, almost 3.5 million people will begin to go hungry? Given what the junta has done over COVID, one could see a situation where perhaps the junta is quite happy that people are beginning to go hungry and fight back as best they can on their own against coronavirus.
Well, I would say that this is going to be worse than Syria, because in the case of Syria, different opposition movements, all armed against Assad regime, which is backed by Russia's Putin, because Putin maintains a naval base in Syria. In the case of Burma, we are not receiving the kind of international support, for the proper, strong resistance, because none of the states in the Burmese in the vicinity of Burma, the Cambodia, Thailand, Bangladesh, China, for instance, or India for that matter, none of these states has come forward with either sensible package to end the country, sinking further into the abyss, or providing any support, legitimacy for the National Unity Government or the people of Burma to resist and essentially end the dictatorship. So in the case of Syria, the resistant movements are fighting ferociously and well armed. In our case, most of the groups are using primitive homemade devices, and so we are in fact far worse than Syria's situation.
Last word to you, John Packer in Ottawa. Aung San Suu Kyi, fresh charges against her this week, essentially powerless. She's completely out of the picture, I guess. You've got the junta hinting we'd like to work with ASEAN, but there's zero trust for ASEAN. Economically, the country is flatlining. It seems as if all the composite bits that we've been discussing are wholly negative. There's nothing in there that might represent kind of light at the end of the tunnel.
I agree that the scenarios really at the moment are almost all negative. And really that's why it's so crucial what the Credentials Committee, this kind of absurd small body that no one ever hears about at the United Nations in September, will have before it a crucial question. I say it's a test for the United Nations because this is about the legitimacy of the United Nations itself. This Credentials Committee, they're not just to decide about some gang that shows up of people, you and me, and claims to speak for a state. They are supposed to assess this application of both the representatives of the junta and also those who are competing for it, the National Unity Government, on the basis of the purposes of the United Nations. And that's supposed to be for the maintenance of security and peace. That's supposed to be for the well-being of the population. That's supposed to be pursuant to the will of the people. If the Credentials Committee exercises its actual own authority under the Charter, it should decide in favor of the National Unity Government. It should not decide, certainly not decide in favor of the junta. That will really be really a nail or several nails in the coffin of Myanmar, and then all bets are off, and God knows what happens in the country. So this is a crucial moment, September coming up, and I really think that we have to think about here the legitimacy of authority and what it means now for the rule of law and for international relations more broadly.
Gentlemen, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you so much for joining us here on Inside Story. That was a very compelling conversation. Thank you to our guests. They were Dr. Sasa, John Packer and Maung Zarni. And thank you too for watching. You can see the programme again via our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, do check out our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. We are at AJ Inside Story. From me, Peter Dobbie, and the entire team here in Doha, thanks for watching. We will see you very soon. For the moment, bye-bye.